Life on the Western Front for the Otagos was a monotonous round of squalid conditions mixed with the ever-present danger of sudden death or injury. Even when they were in reserve, they were never too far away from the line or the sound of guns. When they weren't staying in divisional camps, the soldiers were billeted with locals in reserve areas immediately behind the lines.
When they were in reserve or when they had been given just 10 days off or something, they would be in the next village back from the front, and so they'd be in their billets, and there'd be a bar or something, or sometimes a YMCA and that sort of thing. But they were never really far from the front, and certainly never out of the sound of the fighting.
This is one street I've been able to pin down as a place where the Otago battalions were billeted in 1916 during their stay near a Montier. When they weren't at the front line, which is several kilometres away in that direction, they would be pulled right back here, away from the fighting, for rest and a bit of peace. That hadn't been possible at Gallipoli, so it was a lovely change here in France. And the locals who were still here, they weren't evacuated, they would set up little cafes and cater to the needs of the troops. Now, it wasn't Paris and the high life, but it was a place to have a drink, have a rest, sleep in a nice house rather than in the muddy trenches, and these houses would have accommodated Otago men in 1916.
You were back into civilian controlled areas. So you had the estaminets, you had the local pubs that the French ran where you can go get wine. You had French women, you had brothels, you had all sorts of things where the soldiers could find many ways to spend their money and amuse themselves, and actually to experience civilian life. It's a little bit of sanity to counteract the frontline experience.
This was the most literate army in history, so there was a lot of reading going on and when and how they could. It may have been a funny little book of Burns' poetry or whatever they'd been given by the army. It might have been something more substantive. Of course, they weren't meant to, strictly speaking, but a lot of them wrote diaries that whiled away the time. They wrote letters and postcards home, even though they knew they'd be censored. And put that all together, they managed to while away the time. But boredom was a huge problem for all soldiers in the First World War, and for the Otago boys, it was no exception.
Every few weeks after time in the line, the battalions would be pulled back. They'd go off to their quiet little billets way behind the front lines. But before they did that, they would come to the New Zealand divisional baths. They'd strip off their filthy, dirty uniforms, all lice and mud and encrusted. They'd go in and have a nice hot bath. They'd be given new uniforms, and just for a wee while they'd feel fresh and clean. Of course, the lice would soon come back. Now, here at Montier, the New Zealand divisional baths were set up at a place called Pont-de-Nieppe. This little cemetery, which doesn't have any New Zealanders in it as far as I know, is called Pont-de-Nieppe Cemetery. So I think it must have been quite close to here. Just imagine the relief, stripping off all that filth and dirt, and just for a moment, feeling clean again.
Especially the rural chaps were very interested in how the French managed to keep their farming going without the men, with so many men locked up in terrible battles like Verdun. The women and their daughter, that's both wives and daughters, were left at home to carry out all sorts of things with a degree of improvisation that impressed the Kiwis. For example, dogs taking over the role of horses. Well, of course, one of the main things they did was play cards and gamble on anything. Two up, all those sorts of games with coins. They played lots of those. They could go to the estimates, the bars, and some of them, of course, drink a lot, but a lot didn't. And then, as the war rolled along, Russell was very adamant that they needed organised recreational activity. So rugby and cricket became important ways of just soaking up the time.
Oh, the army was particularly good at organising sports for them, especially after the armistice, but even before that. For example, in 1917, there was a rugby match between the New Zealand division and the French army in Paris for what they called the Somme Cup. And there were 40,000 people there, and the soldiers, the New Zealand soldiers, had been taken out of the trenches the day before and told, you're off to Paris on the bus tonight and you're playing tomorrow, and then come back. And that's what they did.
Suffering as many casualties as they did while at Gallipoli and then again on the Western Front, the Otago Regiment was constantly being reinforced by fresh troops drawn from all over New Zealand. Usually, the new men would first go to Britain, then on to the notorious training base at Otago on the French coast. This was all part of the huge juggernaut of facilities behind the front lines that kept millions of soldiers trained and supplied.
We're standing here in the British cemetery at Otago, the largest British cemetery in France, and actually the last remnant of what was a huge encampment here for the British Army. This is where all their supply base was. This is where all the soldiers went for training before they went up to the line. This is where there were 22 general hospitals for the wounded and the sick coming back from the front lines. They could cater for 22,000 people at once. 100,000 men and a few women lived here from 1915 or so through to 1918, including New Zealanders. The New Zealand camps were way off down to the left. It's now covered with trees and taken into the city. But over behind me to the left was the location of what was called the Bull Ring, a place where soldiers had to go for training for weeks, tramping up and down the sand dunes and treated abysmally by the instructors here who were loathed. They were called canaries for the yellow bands around their arms. Even soldiers who had been to the front line, had been wounded and gone back, had to come back here for training. So if you look at the military service records of so many Otago men, you'll see Otago there, this huge city of 100,000 people, this big camp that was here during the war. Now, this is my best guess from the old maps of where the New Zealand part of the great Otago encampment would have been back during World War I. This area off to my left would have been the specific spot, and just along there would have been a New Zealand road. You can see it on the old maps. Now unfortunately none of the present day road signs recognise any of that history, and it's all been built over. There's nothing to see anymore, but back in the day during World War I, that spot over there would have been the conduit through to the front line for almost the entire New Zealand military forces. And if you've got a serviceman who served here on the Western Front, he spent some time over there. If you made it back this far from the front lines to the hospitals, you're quite likely to survive. In fact, it's over 100 kilometres to the front lines from here, and those who were seriously wounded tended to die before they ever made it back this far. Only 6% of those who got into the general hospitals around Otago were actually lost. But here's one Otago man who didn't make it, Lance Sergeant G. Fletcher, who won the military medal and was killed in the fighting of 3rd Ypres after Passchendaele in October 1917.
If the stress and fatigue of battle and training wasn't enough for the Otago men, strict military discipline was enforced throughout the war. A number of New Zealanders were court-martialed for desertion, and 5 of them were executed during the war. 3 of those who were killed came from the Otago battalions. These executions were controversial, especially as other countries like Australia refused to carry out the death sentence on their condemned men.
Back in 1918, the field behind me was the site of Anzac Camp at Dicky Bush. You can see over in the field behind me some remnants of that camp, those big concrete shelters. Now, a couple of significant things happened here in 1918 at Anzac Camp, or in one of the New Zealand positions here. First of all, Victor Manson Spencer, the Otago Infantry Regiment deserter, was executed here. We saw his grave a day or so ago. Second thing that happened here was that Archibald Baxter from Brighton, the noted New Zealand conscientious objector, was brought here. They tried to force him to be a soldier here. He was subjected to significant abuse at this camp, taken up the line to Ypres and exposed to mortal danger under German shelling, treated terribly. Not every New Zealand soldier was up to the task at hand. During the course of the war, 5 members of the New Zealand Division were executed for desertion. 3 of them were from the Otago Infantry Regiment, and one of them is John Joseph Sweeney, whose grave here at Dartmoor Cemetery near Multa is just behind me. Now, Sweeney was actually a Tasmanian who happened to be in New Zealand when war broke out, and he joined up with the Otago Infantry Regiment. He went AWOL in July of 1916, was captured. Just before the Battle of Fleur-Courcelette on the 13th of September, he was tried, found guilty, and then while his colleagues and mates were busy fighting for their lives, about 7 kilometres away. He was executed at Multa on the 1st of October 1916. For all the fact that he had run away from battle twice, people who observed his execution said that he went bravely to the end. What a shame. And here's another sad case, one of those 5 New Zealanders who were executed for desertion during the First World War, and one of our 3 from the Otago regiment. But this guy, Ngāi from Bluff, Victor Manson Spencer, really hard done by. He'd served at Gallipoli, he'd been right through the war. Here he is, executed in February 1918. He was shell-shocked, mentally unwell. Really, the case for making an example of him, pretty poor. But nonetheless, he was executed and buried here at the Hut Cemetery at Dicky Bush. It was his case, however, that motivated the New Zealand government to mount the campaign for official pardons for all of the men who were executed during the First World War. And it's a site of pilgrimage for many coming here to the Western Front, particularly Maori people who want to honour this lost son of Ngāi Tahu.
Victor Spencer from Bluff. One reason he was shot as an example to the others, because he had deserted and he'd actually been living with a family for quite some months. But the time he was picked up and was tried in early 1918, you know, his fate was sealed. He had to be an example to the others. They couldn't let him get away with that sort of behaviour, because if he did it, who else would be inclined to do it?
On our journey, we visited the graves of 2 out of the 3 men from the Otago regiment who were executed as deserters during World War I, John Sweeney and Victor Spencer. The third, Jack Braithwaite, was executed by the British in Rouen. We're not going there. But here behind me, in Poparinga, just behind the town hall, is the surviving spot where British prisoners were executed, their deserters, and the condemned men's cells just over to the left where they were kept the night before they died. So this is where they would have been stood up, tied to the post, firing squad out here, and bang, they would have been executed. Now, exactly the same setup would have existed for Spencer and for Sweeney and for Braithwaite, but we can see it here at Poparinga. Through the long years since the war finished, many of the British generals of World War I have come under close scrutiny for sacrificing so many lives in apparently pointless campaigns and poorly planned and directed battles. The generals seldom surveyed the ground on which their battle plans were to be played out. More often they would be found in relatively comfortable conditions well away from the front and trying to direct proceedings from there. Here we are in the market square of Poparinga, a town known to the soldiers as Pop and very familiar to New Zealand troops as they marched through here on their way forward to the front at Ypres. It was also the headquarters for the Corps Commander General Godley during the Third Ypres campaign. He was nice and far back from the front here and able to plan his campaign in relative tranquility. Look behind me at the beautiful town hall here. It's really quite a beautiful town. After long service on the front line, New Zealand soldiers would eventually become eligible for a period of leave. This was a highly valuable time for any soldier. Some from New Zealand chose to visit relations in Britain or Ireland, or to relax in relatively safe and quiet areas. The majority, however, were attracted to the bright lights and questionable comforts offered in the big cities like Paris or London. Well, here we are in the hustle and bustle of the famous Paris station, the Gare du Nord. This is the point at which soldiers on leave in the First World War would come to the City of Light and be ready to get up to all sorts of mischief. Now, a young New Zealand woman, Etty Rout, decided to make that trouble safe for them. She developed a safe sex brothel. She gave them condoms and prophylactic kits to defend themselves against venereal disease and tried to make their time in Paris, as well as touristic and exciting, safe. So after meeting the soldiers at the Gare du Nord, Etty would bring them back here to the Hotel d'Orsend, here at 9 Rue de la Michaudière. She operated that specifically for New Zealand troops. She would give them a good, comfortable bed. She would give them good, wholesome food all hours of the day and night. She devoted herself to their needs. She would give them sex advice, and she would issue them with prophylactic kits that she had designed herself.
maybe she'd send them on to the brothel, but it wasn't all about the sex. It was about giving them a good, safe place to stay here in Paris before they had to go back to the misery of life in the trenches.
Well, Eddie Rout was a remarkable woman who, just decided that the official decision not to issue prophylactics or condoms to soldiers from early in the war didn't happen until 1918 and was foolish. So she tried to set up safe brothels in Cairo and then later on Paris. Was much loved by many of the troops, but despised by the authorities, particularly by the bishops of the Church of England, who described her as the most wicked woman in the empire. Which is quite a nice phrase. But as far as many of the men were concerned, she was something of a heroine and an angel who managed to ensure that men didn't go down with VD, which did have terribly high strike rate in both New Zealand and Australian armies.
And for those soldiers who took Etty's advice when they were looking for a good time, here was Madame Yvonne's at number 29 Rue Saint-Lazare. This was a brothel specifically set up for New Zealand soldiers, where the girls were all checked by doctors, where they spoke English, and Etty would give all the soldiers a card directing them to this establishment. And then there was Britain. At any one time in the latter part of the war, almost half of all of the New Zealand troops would be stationed in England. They would be there training, for instance, at the huge camps like that at Sling in Wiltshire in preparation for going across to France and joining the battlefront. Or they might be in one of the many hospitals spread around England and Scotland, recuperating from illness or recovering from a wound. Or they might simply be there for rest and recreation, acting as tourists in London or all over the country. And this, of course, was a great opportunity to visit relations that families perhaps had not seen since the first members emigrated to New Zealand years before. It was a great chance for these families to reconnect.